What happens when a woman who seems to have it all comes face to face with a lesson that no amount of money can buy? It was a typical busy evening at Donovan's, one of the most exclusive restaurants in San Diego. The warm glow from crystal chandeliers reflected off the polished marble floors, casting soft light across the room. Waiters moved with quiet precision between tables, adorned with crisp white linens and perfectly aligned silverware. The hum of conversation, mixed with the clinking of glasses, created an atmosphere of effortless sophistication. It was the kind of place where the wealthy and influential gathered, and where appearances mattered more than anything. At the center of the room sat Evelyn Monroe, a woman whose very presence seemed to command attention. Draped in a tailored cream blazer and adorned with a diamond necklace that sparkled under the soft lights, Evelyn radiated quiet authority. Her manicured fingers curled around the stem of a wine glass as she surveyed the room with an expression of cool detachment. Evelyn wasn't just wealthy, she was powerful. Years of success in high-stakes real estate had made her accustomed to a life where things were done her way, on her terms. She expected perfection, and when it wasn't delivered, she had no problem letting people know. Seated with Evelyn were two of her closest friends, equally well-dressed and polished. Their laughter was light and controlled, the kind of practiced elegance that came with years of navigating social circles where reputation was everything. Evelyn's friends hung on her every word, waiting for the inevitable cutting observation that would entertain them at someone else's expense. On the other side of the room, Emily Collins moved quickly between tables. Young and visibly exhausted, Emily had been working double shifts for weeks, trying to save enough money for college. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight ponytail, and her uniform, though clean, showed the signs of a long shift. Despite the ache in her feet and the lingering fatigue in her muscles, Emily remained focused. She had learned to keep her head down and avoid mistakes. In a place like Donovan's, the staff knew that one wrong move could mean the difference between a generous tip and a scathing complaint. Emily had just delivered appetizers to a nearby table when she noticed Evelyn's eyes tracking her. A cold, amused expression flickered across Evelyn's face as Emily hurried to the kitchen with an empty tray. Emily could feel the weight of that gaze, the kind of look that assessed a person's value in an instant and found them lacking. Tonight, Emily was about to become the target of Evelyn's quiet disdain. What neither of them realized, however, was that someone else in the restaurant had been watching, someone who understood that respect couldn't be bought or demanded. And when the moment came, it wouldn't be Emily who learned the hardest lesson that evening. It would be Evelyn. Emily approached Evelyn's table with careful steps, balancing a tray of entrees in her trembling hands. Her heart pounded as she forced herself to steady her breathing. Evelyn's gaze was already sharp, cutting through the elegant atmosphere of the restaurant like glass. Emily could feel the weight of it, the quiet judgment pressing down on her with each passing second. As she carefully placed Evelyn's plate down in front of her, she offered a polite smile. "Here you are, ma'am," Emily said softly. "I hope you enjoy your meal." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. She lifted her fork and prodded the steak on her plate with calculated disdain. A single brow arched as she inspected it. "Excuse me," Evelyn said, her voice low but cutting. "Is this supposed to be medium rare?" Emily's smile wavered. "Yes, ma'am. The chef prepared it exactly to order." Evelyn's lips curled into a thin smile. "Interesting," she said, lifting the steak slightly with her fork, "because it looks closer to well done. Or perhaps you're not familiar with the difference?" Emily's cheeks burned as a wave of heat spread through her chest. She opened her mouth to apologize, but Evelyn wasn't finished. "You know," Evelyn continued, her voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "it's not that difficult. Medium rare isn't complicated. But I suppose it's too much to expect competent service these days." Emily's hands tightened around the tray. Her eyes flicked toward the floor as quiet murmurs spread through the surrounding tables. A low, uncomfortable tension settled over the room as other diners glanced toward Evelyn's table. "I'll have the chef remake it right away," Emily said quickly, reaching for the plate. "Oh, spare me the apology," Evelyn said, waving her hand dismissively. "Just try not to mess it up this time." Emily's face flushed as she lifted the plate from the table, trying to control the trembling in her hands. She turned to walk toward the kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs. "She's lucky I'm even being patient." Evelyn's voice floated through the air behind her. "It's amazing how they hire just about anyone these days." A ripple of low laughter followed Evelyn's words as her friends exchanged amused glances. Emily's steps faltered, her throat tightened. She could feel her vision beginning to blur as tears pressed against the backs of her eyes. But across the room, Charles Donovan sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the scene unfolding before him. His expression remained calm, but the sharp glint in his eyes suggested that he had heard every word. His hand tightened around the stem of his glass, the tension evident in the line of his jaw. Emily disappeared into the kitchen, the sting of humiliation burning beneath her skin. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, clearly satisfied with herself. Her friends leaned in closer, their expressions gleaming with quiet amusement. But Evelyn had no idea that her performance had just drawn the attention of the most important person in the room. And soon, the evening would take a turn she never expected. Emily emerged from the kitchen a few minutes later, clutching the newly prepared plate with both hands. Her shoulders were tense as she approached Evelyn's table once again, her steps measured and careful. Her heart hammered painfully in her chest, and her breath felt short. Every eye in the restaurant seemed to be on her. Now the other diners had sensed the tension in the air, and curiosity was beginning to simmer beneath the surface. "Here you are, ma'am," Emily said softly as she placed the new plate down in front of Evelyn. "The chef prepared it exactly as requested. I hope this meets your expectations." Evelyn didn't even glance at Emily. She picked up her fork and cut into the steak with deliberate slowness. After a moment, she lifted a single bite to her lips and chewed thoughtfully. "It's better," Evelyn said finally, setting her fork down with a loud clink against the porcelain plate. Her eyes lifted toward Emily with an unmistakable glint of superiority. "But you still took far too long." Emily's throat tightened. She forced herself to stay calm, her hands clasped behind her back to keep from trembling. "And another thing," Evelyn added, her voice carrying just enough weight to reach the nearby tables. "You're holding yourself wrong." Emily's brow furrowed. I'm sorry?" "The way you stand," Evelyn continued, gesturing toward Emily with a lazy wave of her hand. "It's sloppy, no posture, no poise. Honestly, it's no wonder the service here has declined so much." Emily's mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. The low hum of conversation in the restaurant had faded into an expectant hush. Nearby diners were exchanging glances now, their expressions shifting from discomfort to quiet disbelief. "Shoulders back," Evelyn said, her tone sharp and clipped. "Chin up, you're representing this establishment, after all." Emily swallowed hard, her face burning. Her mind screamed at her to walk away, to disappear into the kitchen and never come back out. But her feet remained frozen to the floor. Evelyn leaned back in her chair and smiled thinly. "Honestly," she said with a cold laugh, "it's like they're hiring straight off the street these days." A quiet ripple of shock passed through the room. Even Evelyn's friends seemed slightly uneasy now, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. But Evelyn, emboldened by the attention, didn't stop. "Tell me, Emily," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with condescension, "are you even qualified to work here? Or are they just taking pity on you?" Emily's lips parted, her breath hitching painfully in her throat. She felt her composure beginning to slip. "Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because I've got something special lined up for you tomorrow." Emily stood there, rooted to the spot, her heart pounding. The room was unbearably still. Her vision blurred slightly, and for a moment she considered walking away, letting Evelyn have the last word. But before she could move, a quiet sound broke through the tension. The sound of a chair scraping against the floor. Charles Donovan stood from his table in the corner. His movements were calm and deliberate, but his gaze was sharp and unyielding as he crossed the room toward Evelyn's table. The other diners turned to watch, their attention shifting away from Emily and onto Charles. Emily's eyes widened slightly as Charles stopped beside Evelyn's table, his hands resting lightly in his pockets. His face was composed, but the quiet authority in his expression made the air in the room feel heavier. Evelyn's gaze flicked toward him, her smile tight. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice still carrying that thin edge of superiority. Charles's gaze sharpened. "Actually," he said smoothly, "I believe there is." Evelyn's brow lifted. "And who exactly are you?" Charles's expression didn't change. "Charles Donovan," he said simply, "owner of this establishment." The color drained from Evelyn's face. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. The murmurs in the room grew louder as the weight of Charles's words sank in. "I've been watching the way you've treated my staff tonight," Charles said, his voice low and even. "Particularly Emily." Emily's breath hitched as Charles's gaze flicked toward her, his eyes softening slightly before returning to Evelyn. "And I have to say," Charles continued, "I'm disappointed." Evelyn's lips parted in disbelief. "Mr. Donovan, Charles lifted a hand, silencing her effortlessly. "I'll say this once, Mrs. Monroe," he said, his tone now hard. "Money may buy you a seat at the table, but it does not entitle you to belittle those who serve you." A stunned silence followed his words. Emily's heart raced. Evelyn's friends looked down at the table, clearly uncomfortable, but Evelyn's face had tightened into a hard, brittle mask. Charles's gaze didn't waver. "Respect is not a privilege," he said. "It's the bare minimum." Evelyn's mouth twitched, but no words came out. Charles's expression remained steady as he straightened. "Now," he said coolly, "if you have any other complaints about the service, you're welcome to take them elsewhere." Evelyn's eyes flashed with quiet fury, but she didn't speak. Charles's gaze lingered for a beat longer before he turned toward Emily. "Emily," Charles said, his voice softening, "take a short break. You've handled yourself with more grace tonight than most people could manage in a lifetime." Emily's breath trembled as she nodded. She felt her pulse steady slightly as Charles's gaze held hers for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked back toward his table. The weight of the room shifted. Evelyn's shoulders were stiff as she sat frozen in place, her carefully composed mask now showing cracks beneath the surface. The other diners were no longer watching Emily. They were watching Evelyn. And for the first time all evening, Evelyn Monroe seemed unsure of herself. Charles Donovan's footsteps were slow and deliberate as he approached Evelyn's table. The soft hum of conversation in the restaurant had faded into a charged silence, every eye now fixed on him. His expression remained composed, but beneath the surface there was a quiet intensity that seemed to shift the very air around him. Emily stood frozen near the edge of the room, her hands clasped together as her heart hammered painfully in her chest. Evelyn's friends sat rigidly in their seats, their earlier amusement replaced by uneasy tension. Evelyn's gaze sharpened as Charles stopped beside her table. She lifted her chin, her polished veneer still intact despite the quiet tremor in her hands. "Mr. Donovan," she said, her tone steady but cool. "Is there a problem?" Charles's gaze met hers, steady and unflinching. "Yes," he said. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority beneath it. "There is." Evelyn's lips curled slightly. "If this is about the service," she began, her tone edged with condescension, "I assure you I've had far worse experiences at other establishments." Charles's eyes darkened. "This isn't about the food," he said. "It's about the way you've treated my staff tonight." A ripple of tension passed through the room. Evelyn's smile faltered. "Your staff?" Charles's gaze flicked toward Emily, who stood quietly at the side of the room. His expression softened slightly as his eyes met hers, before returning to Evelyn with renewed sharpness. "Emily happens to be my niece," Charles said, his voice low, but cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. "And I take great pride in the way she conducts herself." The color drained from Evelyn's face. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Her friends shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Charles and Evelyn. "I've built this establishment on a foundation of respect," Charles continued, his tone measured but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Respect for the food we serve, respect for the guests who dine here, and most importantly, respect for the people who work here." Evelyn's face hardened. "I don't think." "But you weren't interested in respect tonight," Charles said, cutting her off smoothly. "You were interested in control, in power." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You assumed that, because you were seated at this table, you had the right to demean someone who was doing their job." A quiet gasp escaped from a nearby table. Evelyn's eyes flashed, her hand tightening around the stem of her wine glass. Charles stepped closer, his gaze cold now. "Money might buy you a table here," he said, "but it does not buy you the right to treat another human being like they are beneath you." The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy fog. Evelyn's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Her friend sat stiffly beside her, their expressions strained and uncertain. Charles's gaze lingered on Evelyn for a moment longer before he turned toward Emily. His expression softened. "Emily," he said, his tone now gentle, "you handled yourself with dignity tonight. I couldn't be more proud of you." Emily's breath hitched. She nodded slightly, her throat tightening with emotion. Charles straightened, his eyes returning to Evelyn. "I trust there won't be any further issues this evening," he said coolly. Evelyn's face was pale, her jaw set in a tight line. After a long, tense moment, she lowered her gaze. "No," she murmured. Charles gave a faint nod, then turned and walked back toward his table. The soft hum of conversation began to rise again, but the energy in the room had shifted. Evelyn sat frozen in her seat, her carefully maintained mask showing the first signs of fracture. And Emily, for the first time all evening, felt the weight of humiliation begin to lift from her shoulders. Charles Donovan stood with quiet authority as the last traces of tension settled over the room. Evelyn's gaze remained fixed on the tablecloth, her fingers curled tightly around the edge of her wineglass. The other diners had resumed their meals, but the hum of conversation remained subdued, as though the entire restaurant was still digesting what had just happened. But Charles wasn't finished yet. His posture remained composed, his eyes sharp as they flicked between Evelyn and Emily. The restaurant's manager appeared at Charles's side, his hands clasped in front of him. He leaned toward Charles and whispered something low, but Charles responded with a faint shake of his head. His gaze remained locked on Evelyn. Slowly, deliberately, Charles took a single step forward, the soft sound of his shoes against the marble floor punctuating the silence. "Evelyn," he said, his tone low but cutting. "There's one more thing you need to understand." Evelyn's eyes lifted hesitantly. The mask of superiority that she had worn so easily before had begun to fracture, cracks forming beneath the weight of Charles's quiet authority. Her friends sat stiffly at the table, their earlier amusement now replaced with visible discomfort. "You seem to believe that status and wealth grant you the right to behave as you please," Charles continued. His gaze darkened. "That the people who serve you are beneath you. That they exist only to fulfill your expectations and remain invisible when they fail." Evelyn's lips parted, but Charles's voice sharpened, cutting off whatever response she had been preparing. "What you failed to recognize," Charles said, "is that the person you humiliated tonight is not only a valued member of my staff, she is my family." Gasps rippled through the room. Several diners exchanged shocked glances, forks pausing midair. Evelyn's expression shifted from surprise to quiet disbelief. Her eyes flicked toward Emily, whose face flushed beneath the weight of the attention now directed at her. "Emily is my niece," Charles said, his tone unwavering. "She's worked hard to earn her place here, not because of who she's related to, but because of her dedication and work ethic. You assumed that her quiet demeanor was a sign of weakness. You assumed that because she was polite, she was someone you could treat without respect." Evelyn's hands curled into fists on her lap. Her friends' faces had gone pale, and the tension at the table was palpable. "You were wrong," Charles said, his gaze sharpened, "and now you're going to be held accountable for it." Evelyn's chin lifted slightly, her gaze flicking toward her friends as though searching for support. But none of them met her eyes. Charles turned toward the manager, who still stood quietly at his side. "Cancel their bill," Charles instructed. Evelyn's eyes widened. "What?" "And take the value of their meal," Charles continued, his voice steady, "along with the bottle of champagne we offered earlier, and donate it to the local organization for young women in the workforce." Evelyn's mouth opened, but no words came out. "Money," Charles said, his gaze never leaving hers, "does not grant you immunity from consequence." A hush settled over the room, the weight of Charles's words pressing down on everyone present. Evelyn's cheeks burned red, but the usual sharpness in her gaze had dulled. For the first time that evening, she seemed unsure of herself. Respect, Charles added, his voice softening but losing none of its strength, is not something you purchase. It is something you earn. Emily's breath hitched. Her eyes glistened as she met Charles's gaze. A quiet swell of emotion tightened in her chest, not just gratitude, but relief. Charles's gaze lingered on Evelyn for a final moment before he turned toward Emily. "You handled yourself with grace tonight," he said, his voice soft now, more than most would have. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. Charles's eyes softened. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "You earned it." Evelyn's gaze lowered as Charles stepped back. Her face was flushed, and her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her clutch. Her friends remained seated, their expressions strained and tense. No one spoke. Charles took a final glance at Evelyn before turning and walking toward the back of the restaurant. His movements were steady and composed. He had said what needed to be said. The lesson had been delivered, and everyone had heard it loud and clear. Evelyn sat frozen at the table, the weight of Charles's words still hanging heavily in the air. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, and her carefully composed expression had slipped into one of stunned disbelief. Around her, the quiet murmurs of other diners filled the space, hushed conversations punctuated by stolen glances in her direction. Her friends sat stiffly, their earlier amusement now replaced by discomfort. None of them made eye contact with Evelyn. The superiority she had worn so effortlessly at the beginning of the evening had evaporated, leaving her exposed in a way she had never experienced before. The manager approached the table once more, holding a small leather folder. Evelyn's gaze flicked toward it, confusion flickering across her face. "What is this?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. The manager's smile remained polite, but there was a quiet steel beneath his gaze. "Mr. Donovan instructed that your bill would be covered," he said evenly. However, he also directed that the amount be donated to a local organization that supports young women entering the workforce. Evelyn's eyes darkened. "You can't be serious," she said. "I assure you we are," the manager replied calmly. He placed the folder on the table and took a step back. "The donation has already been processed. You're free to leave whenever you're ready." Evelyn's hand tightened around the stem of her wine glass. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Her friends exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly unsure how to navigate the sudden shift in tone. One of them, a woman with short blonde hair, leaned toward Evelyn and whispered, "Maybe we should just leave." Evelyn's hand trembled as she set the glass down. Her usual air of dominance had been replaced by quiet vulnerability, a sensation she wasn't used to. Slowly she stood, the legs of her chair scraping against the marble floor. Her friends followed suit, their eyes downcast as they gathered their purses and coats. As Evelyn turned toward the exit, she felt the weight of the other diners' eyes on her. Some were watching with quiet judgment, others with quiet satisfaction. Emily stood near the back of the restaurant, her posture straight, her expression composed. Their eyes met briefly. Evelyn's gaze hardened for a moment, but it was fleeting. The usual fire in her eyes had dimmed. She lowered her gaze and walked toward the door without another word. Charles watched from across the room, his expression calm. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't caused a scene. But the lesson had landed exactly where it was meant to. Evelyn had built her identity around status and control, and Charles had dismantled it with nothing more than quiet authority and truth. As the door closed behind Evelyn and her friends, the restaurant's quiet hum resumed. Emily's gaze lingered on the door for a moment longer before Charles approached her. "Well handled," he said softly. Emily's lips curled into a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," she said. Charles nodded. "You earned it?" As the heavy door of the restaurant swung shut behind Evelyn, a palpable shift settled over the room. The tension that had held the air captive just moments earlier began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet but unmistakable warmth. Diners who had been watching the scene unfold with held breath now exchanged glances of quiet approval. Some offered small smiles in Emily's direction. Others simply nodded in acknowledgement. The sound of soft conversations resumed, but the tone of the room had changed. Respect had been restored, and it was directed toward Emily. Emily stood near the back of the restaurant, her hands still trembling slightly as the adrenaline wore off. Her cheeks were flushed, not from embarrassment this time, but from the quiet recognition that was beginning to dawn on her. She had survived the storm, and more than that, she had maintained her dignity through it all. A woman at a nearby table lifted her hand and called softly, "Excuse me?" Emily hesitated, then stepped toward the table. The woman smiled warmly. "That was impressive," she said. "The way you handled yourself tonight, it couldn't have been easy." Emily's lips parted slightly in surprise. "Thank you," she replied, her voice soft but steady. The woman handed her a folded bill. "And this for your grace under pressure." Emily's eyes widened. "Oh no, that's really not necessary." The woman shook her head gently. "Take it. You deserve it." Emily's gaze lowered to the bill, her throat tightening. She tucked it carefully into her apron pocket and whispered, "Thank you." She turned toward the bar to find Charles standing there, his expression calm but carrying the faintest glint of pride. He stepped toward her, his hands resting lightly in his pockets. "You handled that with a lot of class," Charles said. Emily smiled faintly. "I didn't feel very composed at the time." "That's because you're not used to being seen," Charles replied. "But tonight they saw you." Emily's chest tightened at the truth of his words. For so long, she had moved through life trying not to be noticed, believing that invisibility was safer than vulnerability. But now, she wasn't invisible anymore, and it wasn't as terrifying as she thought it would be. Another table nearby raised their hands, and Emily glanced toward them. "I should get back to work," she said. Charles smiled. "Go ahead," he said. "They're waiting for you." As Emily moved across the room, she no longer avoided the glances or whispers. Instead, she met them with quiet confidence. The weight of judgment had lifted, replaced by a newfound sense of respect. She was no longer just a waitress, she was someone worth noticing. As the night drew to a close, the atmosphere at Donovan's had shifted in a way that was almost tangible. The tension and discomfort that had filled the room earlier had been replaced by a quiet warmth. Patrons who had witnessed the scene between Evelyn and Emily were no longer looking at Emily with pity, they were looking at her with respect. And for Emily, that shift meant everything. She stood at the edge of the dining room, watching as the last few tables settled their bills. A couple near the window smiled at her as they left, and another patron offered a quiet nod of acknowledgement. Emily didn't shrink away from the attention this time. She accepted it, standing a little taller, her shoulders a little straighter. Charles Donovan remained seated at his table, watching Emily with quiet satisfaction. He knew that tonight had been about more than just correcting Evelyn's behavior. It had been about restoring dignity. Emily had handled herself with grace and professionalism, even when she had every reason to break. And now, the room had taken notice. Evelyn, on the other hand, had left the restaurant quietly, her usual confidence visibly shaken. Perhaps she would reflect on the night's events, or perhaps not. But the point had been made. Respect wasn't a privilege reserved for the wealthy or the powerful, it was a standard that should be given to everyone. Emily took a deep breath as the last patrons left the restaurant. Charles approached her, his expression calm. "You did well tonight," he said. Emily smiled softly. "Thank you." "You earned it," Charles replied. As Emily gathered her things at the end of her shift, the lesson of the evening settled into her heart. Respect wasn't something that had to be demanded, it was something that should be extended freely, regardless of status. Evelyn had walked into Donovan's believing that money entitled her to superiority. But she had left with a humbling reminder that true value lies in how we treat others. Respect isn't about wealth or status, it's about character. Emily's quiet strength had shown the entire room that dignity is not tied to privilege, it's tied to how we treat those around us. If you found this story inspiring, comment 1 below. If you think there's room for improvement, comment 2. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next powerful story. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.